San Francisco, California. Since June 11th, 1962, when Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, disappeared from Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, the law has been singing the exact same tune. Three desperate guys pulled off a bold job using nothing but scrap metal and homemade rafts. Then they slept with the fishes in San Francisco Bay's freezing waters when their gear fell apart. The feds dragged the water for bodies, chased ghosts, and shook down hundreds of potential witnesses. They blew millions of dollars just trying to figure out what went down that night. But they've been asking the wrong questions and looking in all the wrong places. They missed the real score at Alcatraz between 1954 and 1963, a tale that ain't about three guys acting alone. It's about one man's quiet genius, building real muscle in a place where he shouldn't have had any, earning respect where brutality is king, and making an impossible getaway a done deal. He moved so smooth that even the screws walking the beat among the cons never saw what was happening right under their noses. That man was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. The story of how he landed in Alcatraz, how he built a kingdom of influence inside America's tightest lockup, and how he quietly orchestrated the biggest prison break in history, well, that's been buried until now. Protected by a code of silence that only death and time finally cracked in May 1965. True Crime Chronicles sat down with 17 guys who did time with Johnson between 1954 and 1963. Men who watched him work every day, knew his system, and are finally ready to talk. Because the joint is closed, and Johnson ain't behind bars no more. And because they think the legend should be told straight, not twisted by rumors and lies. What you get from these talks is a picture of a mastermind operating at the top level. In the tightest spot imaginable, a guy who turned nothing into pure power, solitary into connections, and a cage into an opportunity by knowing one simple truth, something the wardens and the cons couldn't see. Real power don't come from muscle or threats. It comes from brains, respect, and patiently stacking up your chips, making folks want to back you instead of forcing them to fear you. Bumpy Johnson touched down at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary on April 3, 1954. Shipped over from Leavenworth in Kansas, where he was doing a 10-year stretch for a narcotics conspiracy. At 48, Johnson was already a legend in the life. The man who ran the numbers in Harlem. The guy who went to war with Dutch Schultz and Lucky Luciano for turf, building a $20 million empire. Even though he started out dirt poor down in South Carolina. But the feds finally made something stick. Conspiracy to move heroin across state lines. A charge Johnson always claimed was a frame job by the FBI. They couldn't nail him with real proof, but they were hell-bent on getting him out of Harlem, by any means necessary. The ticket to Alcatraz came after Johnson was tagged as a high risk at Leavenworth because he kept handling business from the inside. The Bureau caught wind that Johnson was still calling the shots in Harlem, using coded notes and dirty screws, still deciding on turf and settling beefs, still raking in cash from the rackets, even while locked up. 1,500 miles from New York, the feds decided the only fix was to send Johnson to the one place built to hold the guys who couldn't be controlled. In normal federal joints, Alcatraz, the rock sitting in San Francisco Bay, where the hole and eyes everywhere were supposed to make it impossible for cons to run their streets. They sent Bumpy to the rock thinking it would break his spirit, says Marcus Williams, 71, who did time at the rock from 52 to 61 and bunked in a cell. Williams, a guy who lived 2 blocks from Johnson for 7 years, sat down with True Crime Chronicles. On April 15, 1965, at his Oakland spot, the Bureau of Prisons thought dumping Bumpy on a rock, with screws watching his every move, cutting his visits, reading his mail, and severing all ties to the mainland. They figured that would finally kill his business and force him to do his time in silence. But they didn't know Bumpy. They didn't get that when you squeeze a guy like him, he gets sharper, more dangerous. Alcatraz didn't break Bumpy Johnson. It gave him a puzzle to solve, and Bumpy loved a challenge. Johnson spent his first weeks on the rock, doing what he always did, watching, keeping his mouth shut, learning the machinery before he decided to grease the gears or break them. The other cons say Johnson spent those early days just walking the yard, during rec time, or sitting stone-faced in the mess hall, working the laundry detail without a peep, looking like a man who just wanted to do his time quietly and stay out of trouble. Bumpy's first month on the rock, most of us didn't even see him, says Robert Red Henderson, 68, who did time there from 1953 to 1962. Henderson told True Crime Chronicles on April 18, 1965, he was just another new fish, middle-aged black guy, quiet, respectful to the screws, but the smarts that you couldn't hide. You could tell just by looking at him he was sharper than the rest of the yard, smarter than the guards, too. Read constantly, played chess like a grandmaster, held himself like a king, even when they treated us like dogs. But he didn't push. He was learning, figuring out who held the keys, how the game was played, and where the cracks were. What Johnson saw in those first weeks was a place run on blood and bad badges. Alcatraz screws in the 50s were ruthless, keeping order with their fists, showing zero respect to the convicts, no matter how straight they walked the line, doing whatever they wanted, because on that island, nobody was watching the watchmen. Screws beat men for nothing, threw them in the hole for weeks, over the smallest slip-ups, humiliating guys just to break their will, and show who was boss. The guards at Alcatraz were animals, says James Two-Toes Wheeler, 64, who did his time from 54 to 60. Wheeler spoke to True Crime Chronicles on April 20th, 1965. They'd crack you for a dirty look, strip your privileges for sport, toss your cell, and smash your things just because they felt like it. There was no respect, no dignity, no treating us like men. And the worst part? The screws kept rotating. They'd do a year or two on the rock, then ship out to another joint. So you couldn't get in with them, couldn't reason with them, couldn't ask for a fair shake because they didn't give a damn about fairness. They just wanted to keep their boots on our necks. This world ran on violence, where the guards were deaf to reason, required a different kind of hustle. And Johnson, watching closely that first month, started working a play that would make him the most powerful man on Alcatraz. Except maybe the warden himself. Maybe. The cornerstone of Johnson's power on the rock sounded simple, but it took a master's discipline and a sharp mind to pull it off. He treated everyone, cons and screws alike, with stone-cold respect, and he demanded it back, proving his intelligence every single day, with fairness and his word. Bumpy's way of building an empire was something else, compared to the other inmates, explains Marcus Williams. Most tough guys inside, most guys in the joint, try to take the crown with their fists or a shiv, trading in threats and terror. But Bumpy knew the score fear breeds rats, and enemies in the pen are deadly because you ain't got eyes in the back of your head. So, instead of ruling by terror, Bumpy demanded something heavier. He made them respect him. And respect carries more weight than fear ever could, 'cause a man who respects you steps up to help you on his own accord. No arm twisting needed. Johnson's game was played on a chessboard with levels nobody else even saw. First, the guards. While the other cons looked at the screws with hate written all over their mugs, Johnson kept it cool and professional. Always. Yes, sir, and no, sir, like a man conducting business. He followed the code to the letter, strictly by the book, never giving the hacks a single excuse to put him in the hole. That Manners Act wasn't about being soft. It was cold calculation. Guards who got that kind of respect from Johnson didn't ride his back, and they were more likely to look the other way on the small stuff. Over time, some of these bulls actually started liking the fact that there was one guy inside who didn't make their shift a living hell. Bumpy was the only con I ever laid eyes on, who the guards would talk to like a human being, says Henderson. Most screws just barked like dogs, and the cons barked back or clammed up. But Bumpy, he'd wish 'em a good morning. He'd ask about their day, shoot the breeze about the weather, the news, or the ball game. Sounds small, but it was a masterstroke because it made Bumpy look like a man you could reason with, not just another savage behind bars. And once the guards saw Bumpy as a man of reason, they started cutting him slack, handing him the cushion work details. They eased up on the petty rules, sometimes even slipping him a newspaper or books that the other guys couldn't touch. Bumpy forged alliances with the guards just by showing 'em respect. And those connections gave him a leverage that nobody else in the yard had. Then came the inmates. Johnson showed that same stone-cold respect. To every con in the joint, didn't matter their color, their rap sheet, or where they stood in the pecking order. He knew their names, kept their family stories and backgrounds filed away in his head. He gave counsel when asked, but never stuck his nose where it didn't belong. He made himself a vault, a man who kept his mouth shut and handled secrets with care. Bumpy listened more than he spoke, says Wheeler. If you had a beef, you went to Bumpy and he'd hear you out. Truly hear you. Not just nodding along, waiting for his turn to speak so he could blow his own horn. He'd ask the right questions, remember every word, and if he could lend a hand, he'd do it. Maybe he couldn't fix it right then, but he'd mull it over. Then, a couple days later, he'd drop a word, point you to a guard on the take or another con who knew the score, a play you hadn't even thought of. Guys started lining up to see Bumpy for advice on everything. Legal troubles, family headaches, beefs with other crews, how to handle the screws. And Bumpy helped every soul who asked, didn't matter who they were or what they had in their pockets. That kind of favor built a loyalty that cash just can't buy. Then there was the respect for the mind. Johnson's sharp intellect commanded respect from cons and guards who knew a smart operator when they saw one. Johnson devoured books like a starving man history, biographies, literature, the papers, anything he could get his hands on. He could break down heavy topics with a depth that shocked folks who thought crooks were just muscle. Bumpy could talk Shakespeare, war strategy, politics, the economy, stuff most of us never even dreamed of, says Williams. He'd tell you what to read, explain the big ideas, in a way that clicked. He'd challenge you with his mind, not just his fists. That brain power earned him a nod from the educated cons who usually looked down on the street thugs. And it got him respect from the guards who liked having a man they could actually talk to. Instead of herding mindless animals all day long, Bumpy's smarts made him an asset, in ways that went way beyond the usual yard politics. It was one of the clearest signs of Johnson's rule at Alcatraz. It wasn't just a pastime for him. The chessboard was his altar every single day in the yard. Johnson was a grandmaster, self-taught in the concrete jungle of Harlem, sharpened like a razor over decades of facing down the coldest hustlers. And inside the rock, that chess table in the corner turned into his throne room. Johnson held court there, handing out verdicts, settling beefs, and silently pulling the strings of the twisted politics that ran the cell block. The games were the stuff of legend, Henderson claims. Bumpy would plant himself at that table like a statue of judgment, from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m., regular as a heartbeat, taking on any punk brave enough to test him. And while the pieces moved, men came to pay respects, seeking counsel or dropping intel that required the boss's eyes, begging for him to squash their problems. The screws just saw a board game, a harmless way to kill time, but that table was Bumpy's executive desk, the office where the real business went down, where he gathered secrets, made the hard calls, and kept his web tight. He'd be locked in a match with one cat, while trading whispered secrets with another soldier standing close, all while looking like his mind was only on the pawns. It was a masterclass in handling business. These matches were a strategic front on multiple levels. First, they proved Johnson was the smartest guy in the room, in a way nobody could deny. He crushed nearly every soul foolish enough to sit across from him, sometimes playing multiple guys at once and still clearing the board. Second, it built a sanctuary for the talk, conversations that would get you killed anywhere else. Two guys over a board could discuss heavy matters without raising eyebrows, because the hacks figured they were just talking strategy. Third, it let everyone know the boss was touchable. Any inmate could walk up and ask for a match, meaning anyone could open a line to Johnson without going through a bagman or looking like they were begging for a handout. If you had serious business with Bumpy, you challenged the man to a game, Williams explains. You'd take a seat, make your opening move, and whisper the real dirt between the slides of the rook. Bumpy would nod, interrogate you, and hand down the verdict, all while wiping you off the board. When the checkmate hit, your issue was handled, or you knew exactly how to handle it yourself. To the screws watching, nothing happened, just two cons pushing wood during yard time. Even with the rock's iron grip on silence, Johnson kept his hands on the wheel, managing the Harlem rackets from inside the cage. From 1954 to 1963, the feds swore it couldn't be done, and they never truly caught wise to the operation, even though they shook him down constantly. It took a genius system to move the word in and out of the joint. The letter code. Johnson penned notes to his wife, his sister, to the crew and the blood, letters that looked like standard family chatter, but buried in the fluff were hard orders, hidden in plain sight. Bumpy's mail was a masterpiece, says Theodore Green, the mouthpiece who visited the Rock regularly and spoke to True Crime Chronicles back on April 22nd, 1965. They read like sweet nothings to the family, updates on his health, asking about the cousins, remembering the good old days in Harlem. But specific phrases carried weight, a hidden language only his soldiers understood. If Bumpy wrote, "I hope Aunt Clara is feeling better," it meant, "Squeeze the money harder on Clara Street." If he wrote, "Tell Uncle Raymond to get some sleep," it meant, "Tell Raymond to back down before he starts a war." The censors scanned every line for dirt, but the code was invisible to the uninitiated. You had to know the players to understand the game. Face-to-face meets. Johnson took visitors under the warden's tight leash, blood, and lawyers who made the trek to San Francisco, enduring the shakedowns just for 30 minutes, talking to the boss through thick glass while the guards kept their ears open. The room was bugged with ears, so we spoke in riddles, Green explains. We discussed family, the law, the weather, but underneath the chatter was the real business, invisible to the hacks. I'd tell Bumpy, "Your cousin in Chicago is fighting with the neighbors," which really meant one of the Chicago outfits was in trouble. If a guy came crying about turf wars, Bumpy kept it cool. Tell the kid to try a respectful sit-down with the neighbors first, before he goes reaching for the heavy iron. It wasn't just talk. It was cold-blooded strategy on how to handle business. The screws thought they were hearing family gossip, but the crew was running board meetings right under their noses in the yard. Johnson worked the guys who were catching the bus out, either getting transferred or walking out the front gate for good, turning them into mouthpieces to carry the word. No letters, no notes, nothing that leaves a paper trail for the feds. Right before a guy punched his ticket out of Alcatraz, Bumpy would pull him aside for a quiet little chat in the final hours. Henderson says the boss would give him a job, deliver a message to a specific contact in whatever city they were landing in. New York, Chicago, L.A., didn't matter where. The words were locked in the skull, strictly memory, with nothing written down. The guy finds Bumpy's man on the outside, spills the message face to face, and the Harlem machine kicks into gear to respond by sending intel back through different back channels. Sure, it was a slow burn compared to a phone call or a letter, but it worked like a charm because the messages were ghosts. The prison brass couldn't intercept what wasn't there. They had absolutely no clue traffic was moving right through their walls using this whole human switchboard system. Johnson kept his hand firm on the wheel, pumping out hundreds of thousands of dollars a year back in Harlem. He settled beefs between his lieutenants and gave the final nod on the big plays regarding turf and heavy partnerships, and basically functioned as the chairman of the board for a criminal empire, all while sitting in a cage on a rock in the bay. The Bureau of Prisons figured the isolation of Alcatraz would cut Bumpy's throat, severing him from his crew, says Green. Instead, Bumpy just got clever with how he talked. His operations during those hard years on the rock were actually raking in more cash than they ever did before he got locked up. See, his people knew they had to run a tight ship, 'cause they couldn't just cry to Bumpy to come fix the mess personally. That forced responsibility put steel in their spines and made the organization stronger, and with Bumpy pulling the strings from Alcatraz, he made sure the whole machine stayed in perfect rhythm. Johnson's daily grind at Alcatraz showed the kind of ice-cold discipline he used to survive the cage. The old-timers describe a guy who ran his day like a clock, never wasting a second, keeping his mind and body razor-sharp, even with that soul-crushing boredom hanging over the place that drove weaker men straight to the loony bin. Morning shift, 6 a.m. to noon. Johnson was up at 6 when the bars clanked open, making his bunk with corners tight enough to bounce a quarter, and headed to the mess hall for chow, planting himself in the exact same seat every single morning, with the same crew, a mixed bag of races that showed Johnson's style of building bridges across the usual yard lines. He ignored the politics. After eating, Johnson hit his shift in the laundry room from 8:15 to 11:30 a.m., doing the job solid, but he wasn't trying to win Employee of the Month or impress the screws. Just good enough to keep the heat off his back, but not so good the guards would pile more work on him. Bumpy carried his weight like the rest of them, says Williams. He didn't try to dodge the work, didn't whine, didn't start trouble. He just did the gig and used that time to sharpen his mind and watch the room. The laundry had about 20 guys working the line, and Bumpy sized up every single one of them, learning their whole history, figuring out who could be useful when the time came. The man was always collecting intel, always watching who was connected to who, and who had beef with the guy next to him, watching for who was getting shipped out soon to carry a message. Then came the afternoon shift, noon to 6 p.m., lunch at noon sharp, then back in the cage for the head count at 12:30. From 1 to 2, Johnson hit the books, papers, magazines, whatever the library had. At 2 o'clock, the doors opened for recreation out in the yard, where Johnson walked the fence line to stay loose, keeping himself in fighting shape, even though he was getting older. That time on the track? That wasn't just exercise. That was when office hours were open. Guys would fall in step beside Johnson, walk in the loop with him for a few laps around the concrete, state their case, get the boss's word, and then peel off so the next guy could step up. The walking meetings were pure genius, says Henderson. The guards just saw Bumpy getting his daily steps in, pacing in circles like half the joint, but those walks were strictly business appointments, where Bumpy held court gathering dirt, giving orders, and settling scores without raising a hand. If a guy had beef with another con, he'd take a walk with Bumpy, lay out the facts, and get the wisdom on how to squash the beef without violence that would bring the heat from the screws. Maybe a guy needed a solid, a loan from the commissary, help riding a kite, or an intro to a mechanic with useful skills. Bumpy would listen, analyze, and drop the verdict. By the time the yard cleared at 4 p.m., Bumpy had held court on maybe 10 different matters, all while looking like he was just stretching his legs. The chessboard claimed the hours from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. on days when Johnson wasn't walking the track, handling the office hours business we just mentioned. Evening, 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., chow at 6 p.m., back in the cage by 6:30 p.m. for the head count. From 7 p.m. to 9:30 p.m., Johnson hit the books. He had a taste for history and big lives, focusing heavily on war tactics, political power plays, and the history of criminal syndicates. Johnson studied how the heavy hitters built empires and held the crown when the chips were down, hunting for jewels he could use in his own game. Bumpy read up on Napoleon, the Caesars, Machiavelli, the Chinese warlords, and the American robber barons, Williams tells us. He was constantly sharpening his mind on the stones of history, learning how power is grabbed and kept. He'd preach about these giants over the chessboard, drawing lines between their wars and the battles we fought inside these walls. Napoleon kept his soldiers loyal to the death by showing them respect and bleeding with them. Bumpy would say, "Same rules apply here. You earn loyalty by doing right by your people, not by twisting their arms." Everything he read, he used. Lights out at 9:30 p.m. The guys in the next cell said Johnson was out like a light in minutes, a sign of a clean conscience, or maybe just dead tired from a day of heavy mental lifting. The bottom line? A routine that kept the boss physically hard, mentally sharp, plugged in, and on top of everything, even while locked down in maximum security. Other guys cracked under the pressure of the rock, got the blues, lost their edge, folded. Johnson thrived, or at least stayed top tier, by treating the cage like just another challenge to beat, not a defeat. Bumpy never walked like a beaten man, Wheeler says. He carried himself like a boss, just dealing with a temporary headache, knowing he'd be back on top soon. That swag, that refusal to let the joint break him, lit a fire in the other cons, made them want to stand next to him, serve him, be part of the thing he was building, even if we didn't fully know what the thing was. By 1957, 4 years in, Johnson had built what the old-timers call a ghost empire of heavy influence. It ran right alongside the warden's rules, but moved so quiet and smooth that the hacks never knew it was there. Bumpy ran the rock without anyone, officially pinning a badge on him, Henderson says. No title, no desk, no stripes on his sleeve. But between 1958 and 1963, if you needed a miracle, Bumpy was the man. If guys were ready to kill each other, they'd let Bumpy call the shots, and his word was law. If a message had to hit the streets, Bumpy had the wires to make it ring. If a guy needed cover from a predator, Bumpy whispered in the right ear, and the threat just vanished into thin air. The screws thought they ran the show, but Bumpy held the real keys, because the men respected Bumpy in a way they'd never respect a badge. The weight Johnson carried showed in the little things, the silence that spoke volumes. When Johnson walked into the mess hall, the air changed. Chatter would die down as guys tipped their chins to the boss, not out of fear, but out of pure respect. When he sat at the chessboard, a crowd formed, even guys who didn't know a rook from a pawn, because standing near Johnson meant standing in the eye of the storm when the boss walked the yard. Men shifted their feet, carving a path through the yard just to keep from stepping on his shadow. It was an unwritten law the hacks never saw, but every convict in the joint respected with their lives. When Bumpy opened his mouth, the chatter died. He didn't need to shout or bark orders like a common thug, because when the boss spoke, it was gospel. Williams says the screws were blind to the whole thing. They looked at him and saw a tame, middle-aged con doing his time like a good little boy. They didn't have a clue that Bumpy held the keys to the kingdom, second only to the warden himself. Hell, maybe he stood taller than the warden when it came to moving the pieces on the board day to day. Bumpy's grip wasn't seen because he didn't need to crack skulls or break fingers to keep it. It was built on brains and heavy respect, the kind of thing you miss if you don't know the game. That shadow empire would be put to the test when a trio of hard cases came knocking in '62. They came to Johnson with a favor that would check if his reach was just for keeping the peace, or if he could actually pull strings outside these walls to make men vanish into thin air, right out of the toughest cage in America. The calendar date is gone with the wind now. Old-timers say it went down early June, 1962, though nobody's swearing on a Bible. But the word on the street lines up on how the most legendary break in history went down. Frank Morris had been rotting on the rock since January 61. Shipped over from the Atlanta pen, he'd done time there with a few faces who eventually found themselves staring at the bay, too. Guys who knew Bumpy's weight. Now, Morris was sharp, a real genius with the numbers, IQ of 133, smarter than the devil, and he spent a year cooking up a master plan, digging through vents, sculpting fake heads to fool the screws during the head count, stitching a raft from raincoats. John and Clarence Anglin hit the rock in 60 and 61, also shipped from Atlanta, where they nearly busted out back in 58. These brothers were pros. Slipping cuffs and bars was their family trade. Morris brought them into the fold because you don't pull a job like this alone. They had the hands he needed, and 3 men stand a better chance than a lone wolf. But Morris was smart enough to see the fatal flaw in the whole setup. Breaking out of the cage is the easy part. Staying free is where it gets heavy. Alcatraz sits in ice-cold water, surrounded by currents that drag you down to hell. Even if that rubber raft held up, which was a gamble, they'd hit land like drowned rats, soaked to the bone, naked, broke, and no papers to their name. Nowhere to hide. They'd be back in cuffs before sunrise, unless they had a guardian angel waiting on the shore. Setting that up from the inside is a pipe dream, unless you can get to the one man who ran the streets from his cell and had the muscle to make miracles happen. 3 guys who saw it go down swear this is how the sit-down played out. Morris made his move on Johnson during yard time in early June 62, but not straight up. That brings heat. Instead, Morris challenged the king of Harlem to a game of chess. He took the seat across the board, and between moves, he started a quiet talk. Went on for 20 minutes. Henderson was standing maybe 10 feet off. He says, "I couldn't catch every word they were trading over the pawns." But Frank Morris was sweating, fidgeting with the pieces like his life was on the line. He kept checking for guards. Bumpy, ice cold, just playing the game. Looked innocent, but Morris was leaning in, pouring his heart out in a whisper. You could feel the weight of it. He was asking the Godfather for a life-or-death favor. Tommy Richardson was walking the track, drifting past the table. He caught a piece of the code. Morris muttered something about 3 birds need to fly. Richardson spilled his guts to True Crime Chronicles back on April 25th, 1965. The old man, 67 at the time, did his time on the rock from 59 to 63. Back then, I didn't have a clue what the hell was going on. I figured they were just chewing the fat, maybe tossing around some yard slang. But Morris wasn't just talking. He was speaking in riddles, dancing around the point like a pro, talking about 3 birds need a soft landing or some nonsense like that. Bumpy just sat there, listening, giving a nod now and then, asking the kind of quiet questions that freeze your blood. To any screw or snitch walking by, it looked like just another friendly game of chess. But for those of us who knew how Bumpy ran his business, we knew the score. Morris was begging for a favor, and Bumpy was weighing the cost of granting it. The game wrapped up fast with Morris taking a beating on the board. Shows you his head wasn't in the game. He was playing for higher stakes. Then Morris stood up, shook the boss's hand, and walked off. Johnson didn't move. He sat there for a few minutes, eyes locked on the pieces like they held the secrets to the universe, turning over whatever wild request Morris had just laid at his feet. Once Morris was gone, Bumpy set the board back up like he was ready for round 2, according to Henderson. But he didn't wave anyone over to the chair. He just sat there alone for maybe 5 minutes, pushing pawns around, deep in thought. That wasn't like him. Bumpy always had a line of guys waiting to take a shot at the king, and he rarely said no during yard time. But that day, after Morris bent his ear, Bumpy sat alone, plotting. Whatever favor Morris asked for, it was heavy, Heavy enough that the godfather of Harlem needed a minute to think it through. In the days that followed, early June 1962, Johnson made his call on whether to throw a lifeline to Morris and the Anglins. The guys inside saw it happening, Johnson and Morris trading quick words during that stretch. Little whispers while moving between the cells and the work pits, 30-second sit-downs on the fly. Never long enough to make the bulls look twice, but long enough to get the message across. They'd pass in the hall, and Bumpy would drop a word or two. Just a murmur. Too low for my ears, Williams claims. Morris would give a nod, whisper back, and keep walking. This went down maybe 3 or 4 times over a week in early June 1962. To the naked eye, it looked like 2 cons just saying hello, nothing to sweat over. But looking back now, knowing how it all went down, I know they were plotting the big one. Bumpy was handing down orders, letting Morris know the pieces were moving on the board, telling him exactly what play to make. The moment of truth, the green light, happened right out in the open during one of Johnson's daily strolls in the yard. Richardson, who was tailing Johnson and Morris, says it was around June 8th or 9th, 1962. Just days before the breakout, Richardson says, "I was pounding the pavement on the track when I saw Frank Morris slide in right next to Bumpy. They walked side by side for a couple of laps, and I was close enough to catch a piece of what Morris was selling." Morris asked, "Straight up, is everything ready on the outside?" That's the quote. "Is everything ready on the outside?" Bumpy didn't say a word. He just gave a single, sharp nod. Morris replied, "Thank you. We won't forget this." And Bumpy hit him with a line that still chills my bones. He said, "Don't thank me until you're safe. And listen to me if you get pinched. My name never crossed your lips. I was never here. Capiche?" Morris said, "Understood." Then he broke off and headed straight for the Anglin brothers. They were waiting by the basketball court. That nod, that single, silent sign from the boss, passed from Johnson to Morris on the yard that day in June, was the final seal of approval. It meant the wheels were turning on the outside, that a boat was ready to go, that safe houses were prepped and waiting, that everything Morris and the Anglins needed to ghost, once they hit the water, had been set in stone. Green, Johnson's mouthpiece, says Bumpy didn't do charity. If he gave the nod for Morris to fly the coop, it meant Bumpy had already run the numbers. He knew the plan was solid, he had the muscle in place, and he had made the calls. He decided that the payoff for Morris and for his own legend was worth the heat if things went south. That nod wasn't just a yes. That nod was the result of weeks of cold, hard calculation. It cost heavy scratch, maybe 50 large, spread around the city by Bumpy's people on the outside. June 11th, 1962. The job went down smooth, exactly the way Morris drew it up. After 12 months of plotting in the dark, Morris and the Anglin boys set the stage with those dummy heads. Homemade decoys tucked tight in the bunks, enough to fool the screws during the night count. They cleared the last rubble from the vents, digging through the rock like rats. Using shivs and spoons they'd stashed away, crawled up the shafts to the roof, slid down the wall on a rope made of rags, and pushed that raincoat raft into the bay. Happened late, maybe 10 or midnight. Nobody was none the wiser until the sun came up for the morning head count. On June 12th, when the guards walked the line, saw the fake heads, and realized the birds had flown the coop. By then, it was too late. Morris and the brothers had an 8-hour head start, more than enough time to cross the water, assuming the raft held, enough time to meet the boat Johnson had waiting, right there at Angel Island. The old-timers inside, they tell it like this. When the word hit the yard, Johnson didn't even blink, stone cold. Morning of the 12th, Bumpy is sitting in the mess hall, eating his eggs when the sirens started wailing. Henderson remembers it well. Screws running wild, barking orders, shoving guys back to the cages, initiating full lockdown mode. Every con was asking what went down, and the whisper network lit up fast. Morris and the Anglins were gone. Bumpy heard the chatter just like the rest of the population, but his face? A blank slate, No shock, no smile, no sweat on his brow. He just finished his plate, wiped his mouth, and stood up when he was told, walking back to his house like it was any other Tuesday. If the boss had a hand in the breakout, he didn't show a card. He sat in his cell, cool as ice, while the lockdown dragged on for days, while the hacks tore the place apart looking for leads, grilling every inmate who might know a thing or two. Johnson just read his books and played chess against himself, moving pieces in the quiet, using a little board he kept stashed, keeping the same discipline that defined his whole stretch at the Rock. Williams says the guards sweated everybody, dragged guys out for a sit-down, asking if we'd seen anything out of line, asking if we knew Morris was making a move, or if somebody gave them a push. When they got to Bumpy, he played dumb. Said he barely knew Morris, never said a word to the Anglins, claimed he knew nothing about a plan, and said he was sawing logs in his bunk, just like the rest of the block that night. The screws had nothing on him to make it stick. He kept his nose clean, record spotless, looked like a model inmate on paper. They bought his story and moved to the next guy. In the weeks after June 11th, 1962, the feds launched a massive manhunt. They dragged the bay looking for floaters, chased leads from coast to coast, and put the squeeze on hundreds of associates. The official line, even now in 1965, is that Morris and the Anglins took a dirt nap, claimed they drowned in the drink when that junk raft broke apart in the freezing current. But nobody ever found a corpse, no pieces of the raft washed up on the sand, no proof those three were dead, even after the feds turned the place upside down. And they should have found something if the boys really went under where the feds said they did, inside the walls. The story was different. A whisper among the cons who watched Bumpy operate for years, men who knew his reach, men who saw Johnson and Morris talking shop back in June. Richardson says the whole yard knew Bumpy was the architect. We kept our mouths shut, because being a rat is a death sentence, and nobody wanted to cross the boss. But amongst us, it was gospel. Morris and the Anglins came to Bumpy for a favor, that Bumpy pulled the strings on the outside, and those three men made the clean getaway. The organization was ready for them, and the empty waters proved it. No corpses meant the job was clean. If the bay had claimed their debts, the tide would have washed the evidence up on the sand eventually. Empty waves meant only one thing. They were intercepted by a pro and moved to a safe house. Every con walking out of the Rock after June 1962 carried that whisper like contraband. They planted the seeds of the real score in every federal joint across the map. The details got embellished with every retelling, but the bottom line remained sharp as a razor. That jailbreak wasn't just three guys going into business for themselves. It was a sanctioned operation, backed by the silent hand of the biggest boss behind bars. Henderson notes that after June 1962, the legend of Bumpy Johnson didn't just grow, it exploded. The word on the street was clear. Bumpy Johnson had checkmated the toughest system in America. He orchestrated a hit on the prison walls themselves, all while sitting comfortably in his own cell. The other yardbirds looked at him with new reverence, seeing a man who could pull off a miracle. Wise guys coast to coast got the message. Bumpy Johnson was the kind of heavy artillery you needed in your corner. He was a fixer of the highest order, a man whose reach ignored steel bars and concrete walls. It didn't matter which cage held him, he was the keymaster. But Johnson? He kept his mouth shut. He never copped to it, never denied it, and never breathed a word about the night of June 11th, 1962. Green points out Bumpy's real genius, knowing exactly when to speak and when to play the mute. After the break, guys would fish for details, carefully testing the waters to see if the boss would crack. But Bumpy just offered a cold, thin smile and steered the conversation elsewhere. He knew the score. Admitting a hand in the game would just invite a fresh indictment for aiding an escape. It would bring the feds down on his neck, wreck his business, and break the sacred code of silence. That code was his armor. So he stayed quiet, letting the myth grow into a monster on its own. He let the streets write the story. By keeping his lips sealed, Bumpy kept his hands clean. He collected the respect like a tax, profiting off the impossible feat everyone times thought times he did. By May 1965, 3 hard years after the break, those men were still ghosts. Frank Morris, John, and Clarence Anglin simply vanished, earning their spots on the Bureau's most wanted list. Their mugshots papered every precinct in the nation with fat bounties on their heads for any rat willing to talk. But ask the cons who served time with Johnson, and they'll tell you those 3 definitely made it out alive. They faded into the woodwork far from Cali. If Bumpy set it up, they're still breathing free air. Williams claims Bumpy's pipeline could smuggle a man to Mexico, South America, or even across the pond. The organization provided ironclad papers for a clean slate and enough cash to float them for a while they went to ground in new territories. If Morris and the Anglins had the boss's blessing, they could vanish off the face of the earth, the Bureau coming up empty for 3 years. That just proves the play worked. A boat arranged by Bumpy plucked them right out of the cold black water. They were run to a secure, safe house, handed their papers and the payoff, all courtesy of the Harlem Godfather. They stepped into the shadows where no one looks. True Crime Chronicles tried to arrange a sit-down with Johnson. They wanted answers, asking for a meeting on his Harlem turf on April 28, 1965. Johnson didn't bite. His mouthpiece, Theodore Green, sent over a cold, written statement instead. Mr. Johnson has zero knowledge regarding the incident at Alcatraz on June 11, 1962. He has no association with Frank Morris or the Anglin brothers. He provided no resources for their unauthorized departure. These accusations are built on nothing but jailhouse chatter and speculation, devoid of any real evidence. Mr. Johnson will not entertain further inquiries regarding events in which he played no part. Whether Bumpy actually bankrolled the Alcatraz breakout or not, the mere existence of the story proves his brilliance. The legends the cons spin about his stint on the Rock from 54 to 63 carry a heavy truth. Even in a cage, Johnson turned a sentence into leverage, ruling through brains, fear, and absolute strategy. Henderson puts it straight. Bumpy proved a man with smarts and iron discipline can build a kingdom on any ground. The Bureau figured tossing him into Alcatraz would cut the head off the snake. Dead wrong. Bumpy turned the Rock into his office, spreading his influence through the whole federal system. That reach likely green-lit the biggest breakout in history. The screws thought they ran the joint. Bumpy ran it colder than they did, and they never caught a whiff. Johnson walked free in November 1963. After doing 9 on a 10-year stretch, he stepped back into Harlem and took his seat at the head of the table. The cash had kept flowing while he was away, thanks to the tight ship he'd built, a machine he kept oiled from inside Alcatraz. The prison itself shut its gates in March 1963. The feds claimed it cost too much coin and was too much of a headache to handle. Now, Alcatraz is just a tourist trap where they tell tales about the impossible escape of June 11, 1962. They guess if Morris and the Anglins made it, but the guides ain't telling the real score. That's the story the old-timers are only just starting to whisper about. Years and miles finally loosened the code of silence that shielded Johnson for decades. It's the tale of how one man's brains carved out authority in a place designed to strip it away. How respect buys more than violence. How planning and shaking the right hands can pull off miracles. The story of how Bumpy Johnson held the keys to Alcatraz without a single soul realizing it, running a criminal empire while sitting in a maximum security cage, and maybe orchestrating the most legendary escape ever with a simple nod in the yard. Richardson says the whole place was wrapped in a fog of mystery. How did Morris and the Anglins score their gear? How did they send word to the street? How did they know a boat was waiting in the dark? The official line is, they didn't. They say the boys jumped blind and fed the fish. But those of us who saw Bumpy operate, we knew the man's reach. They had help. They had Bumpy Johnson in their corner. Bumpy gave the order, and the impossible became a done deal. 3 men vanished from Alcatraz because the silent boss of the prison decided to open the door.